Talkin TIDF.
Welcome back to another episode of Talkin TIDF. This is Cameron.
And I'm Stefanie.
And today we are joined by LEE Daw-ming, who, in introducing him, it's a bit of a challenge because he has so many exceptional credits to his name. He is an academic. He is a filmmaker, an award-winning filmmaker, having previously won a Golden Horse Award for Best Documentary. He is a historian. He is a writer. He's just many, many things. And so we are incredibly honored to have him on the podcast today to talk a little bit about his own experiences in the documentary world, while also giving us some history that we hope our listeners will appreciate as they're getting ready for this year's TIDF. So welcome to the podcast, Professor LEE Daw-ming.
Thank you both for having me. Hello, everyone. This is Daw-ming Lee speaking.
All right. And so we should also preface by saying that this year we are incredibly lucky to be showing 4 new digital restorations of Professor Lee's works.
These 4 restored films, they will be screened in the section Reel Taiwan. Yeah, Reel Taiwan is one of the flagship sections of the TIDF. Yeah, as Cameron said before, these 4 films are work by LEE Daw-ming that were screened between the mid-80s and the 1990, I think is the last one, right?
So maybe to help us get to the 80s, it would be really helpful if you might be able to tell us a little bit about what documentary films in Taiwan were like when you were growing up, Professor Lee.
Well, in the sense of a modern documentary film that I ever seen was during my university years. That was when I first had a chance to watch films presented by USIA, the American Culture Center in Taipei. There was a program curated by Mr. Ivan Wang Xiaoxiang, who somehow got connected with USIA, United States Information Agency, which set up USIA's United States Information Service in Taipei. And the film program, including early films like, David Walk Griffith's films, as well as occasionally some documentary films. So the first films that impressed me at the time, although I didn't know the importance of it, was Nanook of the North, directed by Robert Flaherty. And then there's another film that impressed me was The March, directed by James Blue. That film, of course, was produced by USIA about the Civil Rights March in Washington, D.C. At the time, it was produced in 1964. So these kinds of documentary films open eyes for us, but I didn't know, the significance of the kind of style, although they are very different from the kind of films that I have watched before that. For example, before the 1970s. In the 1960s, most of the films that we have a chance to watch were on television or on theater screens. One of the most screened films was called 中国之怒火, The Roars of China, which is actually adapted from Frank Capra's Why We Fight, The Battle of China. But of course, the narrations and some editings were redone by the KMT film studio. But that kind of propaganda film, if we can say that, is the standard type of films, documentary films that we saw at the time. Although we heard of modern documentary film directed by Richard Chen, Chen Yaoqi, it was printed in the magazines, the theater magazine, Liu Bijia and To the Mountain. There's 2 films now has been restored here in Taipei. But we didn't have the chance to watch them because I wasn't living in Taipei at the time. So we heard about them and read the article that was written by Richard Chen about the cinema verite. So I didn't really have any particular vision of what documentary film, especially modern documentary films, was until I went to Temple University in Philadelphia to study first in communication and later in documentary filmmaking.
It's interesting that you mentioned Nanook of the North, because later on you also made an ethnographic film, and we might talk about that later on. And also that you mentioned To the Mountain, because that was screened by TIDF, I think 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was. Yeah. So also a restored version of it, and it was the opening film of the TIDF 4 years ago.
Actually, I thought in the 70s there are some different types of documentary film that we are able to see is on television. That's on especially those films that were made by Zhang Zhaotang and also by Huang Chunming and others. And I think TIDF also did some retrospective of those kind of films, past version of TIDF. But those are more like, either nostalgic type of traveling films or a more experimental, especially Zhang Zhaotang's films. Some of them were early version of music video in a way, right? But of course, it's more than music video, but it's sort of the music play more important phase, more importance than some of the visual.
Well, I also remember reading how in the 70s, some of those television documentaries, by focusing on folk art or sort of local stories, it was a way to, obviously you couldn't be too politically subversive, but it was a way to not have to talk about these huge, larger political narratives. And it was an alternative route, is the way I've heard it described.
Yes and no. Occasionally, they were able to produce some television documentary that is more related to reality. For example, you've seen one episode directed by Zhang Zhaotang about people who were put in sort of like, homes to let them cut off the narcotic
drug
rehabilitation center. Yes, exactly. Some of the films produced on television were about working conditions of, for example, coal miners and others. I mean, those you couldn't see the problems in the industry, but you do have a chance to at least see how they live at the time. So it's not just nostalgic, I should say. Some of them were able to at least relate it to reality.
Maybe pivoting off of that, we can then move into the 80s. And also, I guess it's once you come back from Temple University, we get to this really interesting moment in Taiwan documentary history, which is 1985. I'll set it up a little bit. I don't want to say too much, but 1985, got the Golden Horse Awards. You have a number of films that are entered into a category that is called Best Documentary, and yet no film is selected as a Best Documentary of that year. So as someone who was on the jury, could you please tell us a little bit more about how that happened and why it was, a significant statement?
First, I was surprised to be selected as a jury member because I'm fresh off the boat, so to speak. Just returned from the States in later part of 1984 and then jumped right on to the production of documentary films for the Guangxi Program Services, which is a Catholic production company, on the issues of refugees living in the camps on the border of Thai and Cambodia at the time. So I guess it's because the Golden Horse was sort of responsible by, the 电影图书馆, the film library, the precursors of Chinese Taipei Film Archive, which is now Taiwan's Film and Audio Visual Institute. Yes. Anyway, so I guess because of the head of the film library at the time, would like to have more of younger generation as jury members to be included. So I was invited, and they knew that I studied documentary at the time. Anyway, so during the jury debate on what films to be awarded at the time, including me, but not just me, but other friends, younger friends in the jury, consider those films submitted for awards were mostly neutral or propaganda films for the government, or some of the film made for for tourism attractions. And so we don't think those kind of films are qualified for documentary awards. Of course, there are other members of the jury who are connected to the industry, to the government at the time. They probably did not agree with us about the definition of what a documentary film is. But they are a little bit reluctant to admit any films are qualified to give awards. So they joined us to make a conclusion that there would be no film being awarded that year. And that became a scandal, a big scandal actually, because previously, any year, any production by government studios, including China Film Studios or Taiwan Film Studio or the CMPC, Central Motion Picture Productions, were bound to be awarded the best documentary film or good documentary film.
So if we may spin on this story, interestingly, the year after, your film called Beyond the Killing Field, Refugees of the Thai-Cambodian Border, was awarded and won the Golden Horse Award. And that was also remarkable because it was a private production. You mentioned it was by it's a Catholic foundation, the Guangxi program. And it was on an international humanitarian issue. So kind of also something very new, I suppose, for the documentary scene in Taiwan at the time. Could you comment a little bit on, first of all, on the impact that this film made and how you felt about it when you got the award?
Well, I have to clarify that the previous year's unawarded productions were not meant for myself to be awarded the next year. Okay. The second thing I need to clarify is actually, even though my film Beyond the Killing Fields were awarded in 1986, actually I felt a little bit awkward because the impact of the film was less than the episodes recut by television stations at that time, the CTS, China Television Service. We have shot about at least 10 hours worth of materials. But of course, I finally was able to cut it down to only for 1 hour documentary. For those uncutted footages, the CTS, the China Television Service, actually edit into 5 episodes. Each episode is about 1 hour for television magazine programs. And they actually broadcast those 5 episodes consecutively in 5 weeks. Those 5 episodes actually make more impact than my own documentary films because the audience was, for the first time, have a chance to see the miserable conditions in the camp and the fate of the refugees inside the camp. And so I don't know who made the suggestions anyway. The television stations receive donations from all over Taiwan. At the time, it is closed. The donation was about 10 million Taiwan dollars at the time or more. And that kind of impact is beyond my imagination before participating in the production of the documentary film. I guess it was probably beyond the imagination of fathers Jerry Martinson, Ding Songyun, Shen Fu. I guess it was a big surprise also for the Taiwan society, showing that the sympathy or empathy that Taiwan people were towards the, well, maybe sort of like overseas Chinese, but also including non-Chinese refugees living on the camp. So that's later part we realized that is also the power of television broadcasting, and also the kind of nature of the Taiwanese people. For example, like when Japan has the earthquake or others natural disasters, there's always people who would donate money to relieve the pain of the refugees. But anyway, so I say it's awkward for me because then I see the limit of a documentary film in comparison to television broadcasting of a similar material. But of course, the editing is very different. They also add music. And the music was Luo Dayou's very famous 雅西雅的孤儿,
the orphan of
yeah. Anyway, so that is the kind of style that television try to make people feel, especially feel sympathy for the fate of the refugees, which is not the kind of style that I personally would adopt.
Well, and here I want to add something, which is I think a number of people who are really into sound design and the history of recording in Taiwan cinema know that your documentary is also unique at the time, or special at the time, for having used sync sound, because that was not a given. Just like how there's a parallel story in narrative cinema on A City of Sadness and their use of sync sound. I think people still assume sometimes that, it must have been different in documentary, but it wasn't. Could you just talk a little bit briefly about the sound aspect?
Yes, there was no sync sound films, feature or documentary films made at the time. Even Liu Bijia was not done sync sound. Up to the mountain, directed by Richard Chen, was partially sync sound, but totally sync sound documentary film or feature film was not done until Beyond the Killing Fields. When I was asked to direct the films, fortunately, I brought with me a second-hand Nagra 4.2 sound recorders from the States. I didn't know what to use of it at the time, but I just bought one and brought it back. It was sheer luck that it was immediately used in the making of Beyond the Killing Fields. And also, KPS, the Quality Program Service, owns a sync sound 60mm camera. That was the sheer luck that we were, by coincidence, able to make a sync sound documentary film at the time. So I guess because of that experience, and personally, I also know, I learned how to mix sound in sound studio. So I brought with me also the recording sheet from Temple University. And so I used the sheet to do the sound. It was a two-track sound. And then I was able to tell Du Zhi, who was working on CMPC sound studio, and ask him to do the sync sound mixing in the studio. Fortunately, before that, the first ever, I shouldn't say ever, but one of the first sync sound feature film was Australian productions, The Z-Man. Is it called The Z-Man? Or that film was a co-production of the Australian film company and CMPC. So Du Tuzi had first-hand experience with live sound recording on the field, but not the post-production, because post-production was done in Australia. But at least he knows about the sync sound thing. So that was my film. Beyond the Killing Field became the first sync sound film, sync sound documentary film made in Taiwan in 1986. Later on, City of Sadness became the first sync sound production, feature film production in Taiwan. That was 1989. So we have about 3 years there. Personally, I made a short feature, The Sonar Player, in 1988. It was actually made in 1987, but it was screened in 1988. In that film, we weren't able to make sync sound live during the field shooting. So everything was post-dubbed. But we were able to started to have some local dialects mixed with the Mandarins at the time. At least, after the arrival of Taiwanese cinema, then the languages were a little bit loosened without having 100% Mandarin. So we are allowed to have 49% of other languages.
49%.
Yeah. You have to be less than 50% of language in your films. And that was because in the late 80s, late 70s and early 80s, the Hong Kong New Wave cinema were screened in Taiwan, and they were all Cantonese speaking. And to allow them to compete in Golden Horse, they have to let go of the limits that everything has to be in Mandarin. But for local production, because there's no sync sound, so they couldn't, allow you to do 100% of. Well, it's also by choice of the directors that we decided not to have 100% of Mandarin.
I want to ask one quick follow-up on that, because I think there's something else I noticed, at least in the restoration of Beyond the Killing Fields that I saw just a week or two ago. I thought it was really interesting. So there's a few places where people are dubbing over, there's people speaking English. We can still hear the English vaguely, but it's being dubbed over in Mandarin. But there's a few places actually where you and your collaborators were interviewing people who were speaking Khmer, but actually we get to hear the entire thing of what they're saying, and then we subsequently hear a Mandarin translation, which I actually thought was really cool. That it was almost like, you dub over the English, but you actually let this other language that people might not hear as much. And I wasn't sure if that was a deliberate choice or just a coincidence.
That was a deliberate choice, and I guess that was also a choice of Father Jerry Martinson. If I have a choice, I would just use subtitles rather than to dub in either Mandarin, or we have an English version, which is everything was translated into English with a voiceover over the original languages. So I guess that was the common practice for television documentary, and I guess that's why Father Jerry Martinson, because the film was supposed to be screened in Asia Pacific area for the audience there, because that belongs to the Catholic Communication Society, and the money is also from the Catholic Society, so they have to screen for them, and to make it easier for the audience that it not necessarily common documentary audiences, that they have to make a choice for that.
Oh, that's all really interesting. Well, we just heard that certain technological advances impacted documentary filmmaking in the mid-80s, and you also mentioned already that there were some policy changes. So, for example, language policies that changed. Maybe, and then towards the end of the 80s, of course, we're almost approaching the lifting of the martial law area. So then how would maybe that at the end of the 80s have impacted whole environment for documentary production.
1980s is especially since mid-1980s, it's a very interesting period, and I was lucky enough to have lived through it. Around 1986, the opposition party began to, be allowed, although not totally voluntarily by the government, but they were forced to admit the first ever opposition party to exist in Taiwan. And also quite a lot of environmental movements start to emerge all around Taiwan, not just in many places, but all around Taiwan, to ask for compensations from those who contaminate either, the river or the rice field or whatever. So suddenly, people realized they had the right to claim for the damage of their environment or their fields or their river or whatever. And so I guess that sudden burst of the people's voice start to caught attention of people like us. We start to record visual and sound of those social movements. And that is when the Green Team started in around 1986. But of course, before 1986, people start to record with still or moving images of those kind of discontent.
That's a great framing. That's also very helpful, because when we talked to Wan Ling just the other week, and we talked a little bit about the history of TIDF, and she provided a great link of sort of what was the relationship between social movements in the 90s, television documentary in the 90s, and also
technical equipment.
Technical equipment, yeah. And so I think I highly recommend to listeners, if you haven't listened to Wan Ling's episode yet, these two go together very, 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 very well.
Self-promotion.
It happens everywhere in the world, especially in Asia, East and Southeast Asia. I mentioned earlier that it happens in Korea, South Korea, and also it happens in the Philippines. And also in South America. I mean, you have a lot of revolution at the time, and those new equipments or documentary equipments were linked hand in hand with the revolution movement.
Mm.
Well, then maybe we can then speed forward a little bit and maybe think a little bit about the relationship between equipment and documentary in 21st century Taiwan. Because this is something I've been thinking a lot about as I've been going to some of the events in the lead up to TIDF, and also some of the comments you've just shared about how, for instance, it was lucky that you purchased the Nagra in the US, happened to have it available, whereas you've taught before, and you've taught students who have a very different relationship with recording devices. Like, for instance, the distinction between sync sound and post-sync, I think, is very novel to a lot of younger technology users. So I'm also curious what your perception has been of maybe the relationship between documentary and technology in the 21st century.
Well, the first thing is that my generation has gone through first filmmaking with double system. Double system means that the making of sound and the making of images are separated and then put together in the post-production period. And then we are the first generation to have gone through video. Video started to emerge in the 70s, especially with the portable video that was invented by Sony called Portapack. And it's set free of a big camera that was used in television studio, which is pretty heavy and unmovable on the field. And so Sony has produced a Portapack, which is still quite heavy and cumbersome, but it's already set you free to be able to use the camera and sound equipment on the field. And then by editing, we were able to use dubbing recorders, two recorders, dubbed images from one recorders to the other as editing tools, a 3/4-inch tape machine. And so I was the first generation to do that in Taiwan as well at the time. Then you have the ENG, meaning the electronic news gathering, which is mostly used in the news report. But then, of course, like people like Zhang Zhaotang, they use that to make documentary films on the field. And those videos have no double system. They are only one system. That is, you make the sound on the tape while you are producing the images. Of course, previous than that, there was a single system, 16 millimeter film camera at the time for the use of television news in the 70s. Of course, in the States, it was in the 60s and then 70s. And then so Zhang Zhaotang, they were able to make television news and then television documentary with some 16 millimeters single system. But the younger generation who has never gone through those stages, they never heard of double system, because since ENG and then you have home video, everything is single system. You make sound, you produce sound at the same time as you're producing images. So here we have the cell phone, and the smartphone can make recordings of sound and good sound. I should, stress that the good sound and good images, 4K or even 8K images with a smartphone. So for generations who only got to know smartphones, they couldn't imagine that my generation, we were living in ancient, handmade, pre-modern society at the time.
Actually, the advent of the new technology and these lighter movable cameras had an enormous impact, especially also on ethnographic filmmaking. And well, you also made ethnographic films, and actually one of them will be shown during the festival. It's called The Songs of Pastai. And that's a collaboration with Reel Taiwan, who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago. Well, this film I would like to talk about for several reasons. Also because part of the festival this year is the focus program on the sensory ethnographic lab by Harvard University, with their very own approach on ethnographic filmmaking. And well, we would just like to know a little bit about what was your idea about ethnographic filmmaking when you embarked on this project with Reel Taiwan. And also if now I suppose you know the films produced by SEL. Would you say that has impacted your idea of ethnographic film?
Well, first I should say that during my study at Temple University, it happens that my advisor, Ben Levin, has made ethnographic film. He is a filmmaker, of course, and he co-produced ethnographic films with Jay Ruby, who was one of the important figures in American Ethnographic Film Society. So naturally, I know what ethnographic films was, and I have read quite a lot, although at the time I didn't make any ethnographic film at the time. But ethnographic film was a minor genre for documentary films because there are also dispute about what an ethnographic film should be. The definition of ethnographic films very different even among the ethnographic filmmakers or the anthropologists themselves. And very few people actually practice the making of ethnographic films. Jay Ruby has a more strict concept of what an ethnographic film should be. I mean, only ethnologists or anthropologists can make ethnographic film, according to him, because his idea is that you need to have a training, anthropologist training, in order to make films that it can be called ethnographic films. You must have, the theories before you go into the field to make the film. But of course, there are other people who has different ideas. So when I first returned to Taiwan, and when Hu Tai-li invited me to co-direct Songs of Pastai with him, I knew, what ethnographic film can be. But Hu Tai-li has a more romantic idea of what the ethnographic film should be. He did not buy the idea of Jerubi. She thinks that ethnographic film should have aesthetics and should be not just for anthropologists or for the student of anthropology, but also, can have something to offer to the general audience.
Why do you think that she did choose you as a director?
Well, because I have the tool, and also I have the knowledge. And he was very disappointed to her first ethnographic film, because that film was not made synch, and because the film was shot with Bolex, which is only, each shot lasts only about 1 minute or so. So she wanted to make a real film with synch, and I have the capability to help her. And also, I guess she knew me when I was in New York. I visited New York very often at the time. And a lot of people on the East Coast of United States who studied film at the time were together. For example, like I'm Lee, and we meet, from time to time, 3-4 times per year, especially during the summer. So I spent a lot of time there. And Hu Tai-li was studying, actually she got her PhD degrees from City University, but then she went to study filmmaking program for 1 semester in New York University. So we knew each other at the time. So of course she knew that I'm returning to Taiwan, and with a tape recorder, to her, this is the good news. So when she got the money to make the Songs of Pastai, she invited me and also Dang Tang to be the cinematographer. And so that was a perfect team for her.
Well, then I want to build off of that, because then in the SEL program, we have a critique of a very famous ethnographic film. So the critique of Dead Birds, which is expedition content. And expedition content is almost entirely just sound, with very few images. So I'm curious, have you had a chance to see it yet?
Well, it was 3-4 years ago when Taiwan Ethnographic International Film Festival asked me to be in the selecting committee. I have the chance to not watch because there's black, everything is black, but I have the chance to watch the film. And I also have written the articles on the Dead Bird. And of course, Dead Bird is notorious for forcing the filmmakers' ideas on the minds of the Aborigines that he shot. But that film is being considered by many ethnographic filmmakers as a paradigm. It's a very important film. But I know the problem of the films, but there are other ethnographic films. I taught my students about what ethnographic film can be and that sort of things. So naturally, when SEL began to appear some 10 years ago, I think, it struck me that it can be called ethnographic film because it's totally against anything I learned about ethnographic film. Personally, I think it was, a revolt against the previous ideas of what ethnographic films is. Okay? But to me, the serious problems about SEL is there's no knowledge, no understanding after watching those films. I mean, I've seen quite a lot. I see 4, 5. I mean, some of them are so interesting. But you see and you hear just like you were there in person. So it's sort of like an immersive kind of experience for anyone who watched the film. But then, what do you learn?
I exactly have the same thought about that, but I was not...
Because there's no context. There's no explanation. So there's no knowledge by watching the film. I mean, you have the experience. But films should be more than experience. I mean, you have to gain something. We are experiencing everything every day in our life. So you do have a chance to go to a foreign land, in a foreign situation, to watch how people live. But so what? I mean, for example, there's a film about the demolition work in China. So you saw demoralized buildings, and that's it.
I feel exactly the same, because I know where they are coming from. They don't want to impose understanding on the viewer, and that's why they completely leave you in the dark. But then I personally think it's almost like withholding that knowledge, because they have the knowledge, of course. They know the background, the filmmaker know, but the audience not necessarily. So I feel almost like they're withholding something from me. And then it becomes my responsibility maybe to read and to research and to make me understand the film that I only got immersed in. So something like that.
One thing is that in the past there's a debate about ethnographic films as science versus art. Okay. That was the dichotomy of two types of ethnographic films. But for SEL films, it's neither science nor art. To me,
I think they would probably maybe say not science but art.
I mean, what is an art? Art is controlled. You have to have something to say with an art in our work. So we don't know what they're trying to say. Maybe tedious. Maybe repetition, maybe unhelpful, or whatever. I don't know.
Well, and I will say, I think one of the exciting things we have coming is that there's going to be a number of roundtables and discussions where we're going to have some SEL filmmakers. We're also going to have some academics participating. And so I think there will be some debate. I think we're going to get some discussions.
Well, hopefully,
actually, I would like to ask them this
hopefully
question.
there will be someone from the ethnographic film circles or people who teach ethnographic films in Taiwan.
I think this again is a reminder that by having those films programmed in a festival where there's also a completely different vision of ethnography, for instance, in the film that you made, but also there's some other films in other programs that also deal with similar questions. I don't want to go so far as to say counter programming, but it's contrastive programming.
Yeah. But it needs a context.
Yes.
I mean, when programming SEL films, you need to tell people, what other films were like. I mean, you cannot just suddenly you throw something in and then try to cause a debate. I mean, people usually has no background knowledge were able to know what is it and what is not.
Well, and I will say, having done translations for some of the subtitles for the SEL films, I had to do some contextual research to be able to do, which, I mean, technically as a translator, you should always do contextual research, but among film translations I've done, it was an unusual experience.
But if you can go back to Songs of Pastai, I would like to ask you, Professor Liu, when you rewatched the films for the restoration, I believe you were sort of accompanying the restoration process. So how was it when you watched?
Well,
when
I
you watched
was
the film?
I was really happy that those films were restored, because you may not know that the quality of the left in Taiwan in the 80s and 90s was not very good. I mean, the colors are not correct, and we didn't have a lot of time for color corrections at the time. And then the left actually most of the time was sloppy in, they didn't have very clean waters, so that there's quite a lot of dirt and maybe some hairs, here and there. And then, of course, the screening is less than favorite for any 60mm films. The light and the sound and everything was not perfect for the kind of quality that you would like to have. So now with a digital restoration, I was able to correct color-wise as well as sound, so that you can have the best possible effect. So actually, I'm able to watch the films in its best condition ever. And they respect my ideas. Some of in some of the titling was slant, and so I was able to persuade them to to put it back what it should be. Of course, they have concerns about the restoration ethics, whether we should change anything or not. But I persuade them that this is for screenings purpose. This is not just to restore the film as it was. But they do have the concerns because of the F standard says that we shouldn't change it.
But maybe this also speaks to a slightly different ethical framework for restoring documentary versus narrative film. But for instance, in a really interesting move, when they recently restored two of Li Xing's feature narrative films, My Native Land and Story of a Small Town, they added a Hakka dub to both because apparently that was Li Xing's original wish, but he could not accomplish that under martial law. And so that, again, there was some debate around that, but it was realized. But adjusting text, for instance, that almost to me seems like
I mean, they agreed to the change, but for some, for example, pulling out the hairs and the kind of things, some do have concerns that I should do that.
Well, but I think it's film is your work, so if it's restored, then you should have a say in it, isn't it? I don't find it unethical.
Yes and no, because film is not mine anymore, because it becomes a common goods to the archives.
Well, it's collective memory, right?
Yeah, so whatever, you should make the films as it was screened at the time. But for me, I mean, the screening condition was not good at the time. And you are restored for the current audience, not for the previous, probably already gone to this.
I think that's a great ethical conundrum for us to maybe end on, because unfortunately we are running short on time at this point. And I feel like we could keep discussing with you for even longer, because this is such a fascinating conversation. Stefanie, are there any other things you want to add as we wrap up?
We should ask our classical question.
Yes, exactly.
So, what would be your recommendation for this year's festival? If you had to pick one or two films, what would you recommend our audiences to watch, except of course for your own films?
Personally, I'm interested in watching this film, Hua.
Oh, love
okay.
it.
Yeah, personally because I know the family, and I have thought about making the film, but then I let it go because I probably wasn't the best person to do it anyway.
Thank you so much for joining us.
My honor and my pleasure.
It was wonderful. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope you guys listening to this podcast have a chance to come to watch those wonderful programs.
And also, if you don't get a chance to watch the programs during TIDF, you might be able to. We do have some select things that will be available online after the in-person festival. So you can try catching some. I know there's one portion that will be in the 10 days after the physical festival. So that would be from the 11th to the 20th of May. And then also for about 3 months afterwards, some of the public TV documentaries will also be available online. So make sure to check everything out.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.